Okay. Yeah. Is it recording?
Yeah, it is.
Dimitri's like to be.
I don't want to be in the video.
Your nice arm is right there.
Showing his
All right,
bicep.
okay, let's not go there. What is a nice arm? All right, so remember, somehow we had this fictional. Jeff, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I was just curious about how this broader topic of international policy coordination would tie into the concept of the Trinity, or the trilemmas.
What? Yes,
Um,
yes. So what? Do you know what this Trinity is? It's not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It's the man, the man, and the Son.
It's essentially that a country has to choose between two or three options: with an independent monetary policy, free capital movement, and flexible exchange rate.
Okay. We have not covered that in here. But the idea is that the country will have to make choices among three things. And I'm now paraphrasing Jeff. First, should the exchange rate be fixed or flexible? Second, should there be free capital flows and no constraints on any of the capital flows? And three, to what extent monetary policy cannot pursue domestic objectives? That has become as the unholy trinity, or the divine trinity, or the impossibility trinity. So a country cannot have fixed exchange rates, perfectly mobile capital flows, and at the same time have monetary policy being concerned about output. Some people have a way, so just put that in. So normally this is done in the following way. So you will have and you will have this to be this is the way it's labeled, and I will you will see that I get hung up on words. Independent monetary policy. Fixed exchange rate. And free capital mobility. All right, so you have to, if you want to have free capital mobility and you want to have a monetary policy that is being independent, then you cannot have fixed exchange rates. You have to be flexible. If you want to have fixed exchange rates and you want monetary policy to have an effect on output, then you have to give up free capital mobility. Which the absence of free capital mobility is that you have regulation that limit either the amount or the type of capital coming into the company. Okay? Now, the question that Jeff is asking is whether this particular trilemma is relevant for international policy coordination. My sense is that yes, because if we have fixed exchange rates between the two countries, then the channel through which changes in monetary policy affect one country or the other is suppressed. And so, for the type of work that we're having here, the presumption is that one of the mechanisms that is going to transmit a development in one country to another is going to be the exchange rate. If we fix that, then well, it's like going playing basketball without a ball. And it's just, I mean, we can take pictures of ourselves in the court, but that's it. You know, we're not playing anything. All right. And so that's the answer to his question. I now want to, in the interest of making my views annoying. Here is what I don't like about the choice of the words independent monetary policy. That's the way that it is characterized. Exhibit A. Exhibit B is that exchange rate is the extent to which exchange rates are fixed or flexible is a policy decision. It's not something that grows in trees, and so we either have it or don't have it. The central bank decides whether the exchange rate should be fixed or not fixed. And so, when a country decides to have fixed exchange rate and free capital flows, people say, well, then you cannot have independent monetary policy. Well, that doesn't work with me, because it was the central bank chose fixed exchange rate independently, right? And so if you want, so we cannot have it both ways. And so if we want to have this trinity in action, I will not use the words independent monetary policy. I will use the words to monetary policy, ability to affect economic activity. That would then be gone. And so it is, the monetary policy can either affect the exchange rate or affect economic activity. And so if it chooses to affect the exchange rate, then it gives up the other one. But it has not given up independence. It actually is using its independence. Okay, does that answer the question? All right, so I'm gonna try to use the file that it is in Blackboard. The chart, I don't know what is it. So Tanya was already complaining to me like this. Now she was being polite about the whole thing. It looked like some squiggles in there, which is a nice polite of saying, what the hell is that? More or less?
Yeah, you got it right.
All right. So remember, we have this policy beliefs. We don't know whether that thing exists, but we assume that it does. And once you assume that it does, there's going to be a level of the domestic money and a level of the foreign money that yields that policy beliefs. What we're about to start doing here is going to feel weird, because I'm going to start changing monetary policy both at home and abroad, and you're going to be thinking, they don't do that. And you will be right. They don't do that. But at this point, we're not crafting monetary policy. At this point, what I'm doing is deriving a difference curve. And so I'm going to be treating domestic and foreign money as though I had absolute control over them. The same way when you derive an indifference curve for your utility function, it asks you to entertain the utility that a collection of bundles may give to you. So in effect, it is asking you to go to the supermarket and imagine all the bundles you can have. But I don't do that. I go with a shopping list, put the crap in the cart, and get out. So you're not doing this. And so what I'm going to be doing here is changing the levels of the money supply. And monetary policy doesn't do that the way I'm describing it here. What I'm doing is deriving an indifference curve. All right. So imagine that the foreign money supply declines. So if we were at the original policy bliss, what would, without going through any emotions, without going through any reasoning, just we start at policy bliss, and something happens, the money supply, the foreign money supply declines. Would the objective function, would the loss increase? Yes or no? Think of this as a question that you have 5 seconds to answer. You don't have to derive anything. You don't have to compute anything. All I'm asking you is to acknowledge that we're starting from something called bliss and changing one of the components of that bliss. Would you, David? What would, yeah, no, I know. Would the loss increase or decline?
Increase.
By definition. Because if you're at bliss, anything else that you do will move you away from it. So if you start at a point A here, which we define as bliss, as nirvana, and then you change any monetary policy, you don't have to go through some involved calculation. You know that you're going to be, or that country's policymakers are going to be worse off, not because they made an error, or because they're starting at heaven. So if you're in heaven, and you says, well, where else could I go? It doesn't matter, you're gonna be worse off. Why? Because heaven is it, right? It's by definition it. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna now abandon these philosophical dealings and then it's back to the plumbing here. So how would it work? So a contraction in the foreign money supply will raise interest rates abroad. It will depreciate the domestic currency. Jeff, you see the role now, right? That this linking here from interest rates to exchange rates presumes that the exchange rates are flexible. If the exchange rate were fixed, then what's going to happen is that this series of events will not take place. Okay? All right. And so the exchange rate depreciates, output increases, the current account increases, and therefore the loss increases. Once again, this is happening for two reasons. First, the goals are stated that it doesn't matter if it is a surplus or a deficit. We care about deviations. We don't care about the direction of those deviations. And the second thing that matters is that if you start at bliss, anything you do, anything that moves your way will make you worse off. All right? Okay, so I want now to imagine that the original, that we had a value of 0 for bliss, and so now that the loss function, as the monetary policy, foreign monetary policy contracted, it went from A to B, and that the loss function increased to 10. All right? It's higher. Now the only thing we got so far is point A, point B, and knowledge that L went up. That's all we got. And what we're after is the derivation of indifference curves. And so we're going to start doing now things that monetary policy makers don't do, but they're not trying to derive indifference curves. Well, suppose now we start at point B, and we say again, now instead of racing, instead of doing something to foreign monetary policy, let's do something to domestic monetary policy. And so, if we were to increase the money supply at home, so we go from B to C, then what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the domestic interest rate declines, the currency depreciates, output increases, the current account increases, and we have now an increase in the loss function on top of the one that we had at B. Right? So, the loss here at C is larger than the loss at B. Okay? If you just write LC greater than LB. Now comes the part that it is going to look like magic. So far I'm saying if you have a knife and you slash your hand, blood will come out. So that's effectively what I'm saying. What I want now is to entertain the possibility that at the same time that I'm increasing the money supply at home, I increase the money supply abroad. So I move to D. So if we were to start C and I were to contract the money supply, then I will have a loss function less than the one at C. That sounds weird, right? Let me see if I can go, let me see if I can do this slightly different. I'm not going to put the axis. So we start here, L0, okay? So this is point A. The foreign money supply contracts, and I'm now at B. And I'm going to call this L equals 10. Suppose now that, oh crap, I made a mistake, let's undo this. And we'll go from 10 to 0, correct? If I were to reverse what I just did, then the loss function will decline, will go from 10 to 0. Okay, keep that in mind. Here, I said, oh, I need to just put it in. So now I'm going to raise the domestic money supply and reach point D. And I'm just gonna put a number 15. Okay? I now want to, this is what I mean by weird. Okay, so these guys don't do this. I want now to contract the monetary policy, the foreign monetary policy in this direction. But I want to contract it enough that it takes me to a point D such that L equals 10. So that it has the same loss as in here. Okay? Ivana?
I don't understand why. Why would
I don't
you-
understand what?
Why you'd go from C to D instead of just taking back what you did and go back to B to have the same loss function of 10.
Or why don't I then go from here to there and skip the rest of it?
No. Once you're at C, why would you go back to B instead of going to D? The loss function is both.
Oh, so why do I do this and not go down? Okay, because then, remember, that question is important because what we're after is not getting a point. We're trying to get a collection of points with the property that the loss is the same. Right, and so intuitively, when I go, start at A, okay, 87, if you wanna say this is pointless, because once you know that you're in heaven, anywhere else is crap, fine, so we stay here and then move to, I don't know, fiscal policy. But to the extent that I want to derive an indifference curve, then I say, what would happen if the foreign money supply declines? Well, then I know that my loss is going to increase. Now comes the second step that it is stupendously weird, that we said, well, what about us raising the money supply? Well, that takes me farther away, so now L is 15. Okay, not content with all this gymnastics, I'm now going to ask the question of by how much I should lower the foreign money supply so as to improve L from 15 to 10. And suppose this is 0.10. What do I know now? That
I guess I'm confused why, or how we're moving to D when the foreign money supply is decreasing again.
well,
Shouldn't it be
Shouldn't it be
increasing?
increasing?
Yeah.
To see the
well, I
D?
mean, that's, if I treat 15 as greater than 10, then it's decreasing, right?
But is it a loss function?
I'm contracting the foreign money supply. But let me make sure that I have the question right. Is your question, how do we go, why is it that when we go from C to D, L goes down?
No, why?
No. The foreign money supply.
That's what this is the foreign money supply.
Isn't the
But it
line
goes up, right?
increasing right where it's?
Also, I probably misspoke. So I'm increasing the foreign money supply. My apologies. So I'm increasing, Tanya has a way of making it clear, right? Look at my hand, it's increasing, right, Tanya? Yeah, way to go, Tanya. My apologies. So, okay, Tanya's correct. So I'm now increasing the foreign money supply, and I go from C to D. And I want to increase that foreign money supply, not just, well, how about twice, but just find a number such that L equals 10. What I now have is 2 points, B and D, with a property that they have the same loss. And so, if you were to ask policymakers, what are this is a foreign money, this is a combination of domestic and foreign money supply. Let's just pull that here, MB and M star B. And let's just have this also M star D, and D. These two values will give the policymaker the same indifference. It's the same loss, so they will be indifferent between the two of them. Okay? And so you can imagine that rather than going from B to C, we can go to C prime, and rather than going to D, we go to D prime. Okay? And so now, remember, we're assuming that we can find these values. And so, effectively, we're going to find a collection of points of M star and N such that they have the same value for L. So that the policymaker will be different between this and that. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, David.
I would like to point out that that mean in your slides for the line after this, it says starting at C if foreign money supply increases.
Oh, you mean here?
A lot of.
Yeah, that's an error. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Tanya. That's an error. Just change it. Okay, so notice that what we're doing here is it looks contrived, looks convoluted, and it sure so looks unrealistic. What we're doing is effectively manipulating domestic and foreign money as though we have absolute control over them. And for each combination of domestic and foreign money, we ask the policymaker, are you indifferent? And if the answer is yes, we record that value. And so, in principle, we can get combinations of N and N star such that L is fixed. So remember, we started here at A. We then crafted some kind of, let me see if I can, we then crafted a contraction in the foreign money supply. Not that the foreign policymakers had any intention of doing that. And then we responded, so B will be here. Then we went ahead and changed our money supply. We raised M to this point in here. It doesn't show. Let me, hold on a second, do me a favor, just 1 second. I'm gonna try to see if I can make this a little bit. There's something about if you invoke the PDF from Blackboard, it doesn't bring all the functionality. And so I'm just kind of, whereas in here, I think I'm gonna I'm just gonna type here B. So type there B. So that's the B that was in the earlier one. Then I raised the money supply, the domestic money supply, and wind it up and try to make this as vertical as I can. Something called C, which I'm putting now in there. And then I said, let's expand the money supply, the foreign money supply, and get our way to D. So you see that, and we could start, I could have had another point between B and C and repeat the experiment. So I'm deriving the entire indifference curve for the domestic policymaker there. Okay? The next question is, there is in principle, the farther out from Bliss is indifference curve, reverse off is the policymaker. So a policymaker is probably prefers L1 to L2, and he prefers L2 to L1. Ron? Okay. So this is the indifference curve. The next thing is going to be and this. Okay. The next thing is going to be, okay, now we have characterized the difference curve, which is another way of saying we have characterized the utility of the policymaker. This is not unlike what you do in micro, where they show you a bunch of bundles and you're supposed to connect A to B to C to D, and it says, I'm indifference among these three idiots. Right? Okay, that's your utility function. Now the next step is going to be maximizing it subject to your budget constraint. We're going to do something parallel here. We just went over the policymaker being able to rank the different bundles of foreign and domestic policy. Great. That by itself doesn't tell which one that they're able to pick. We're going to be able to pick one that depends on these constraints. Okay. And so the idea is going to be to minimize the loss function subject to the behavior of output, subject to the behavior of the current account. What we did before was to have in here the output gap or the inflation, and here the unemployment gap. And we minimize that subject to the Phillips curve. So there is an objective and there are constraints. It used to be inflation and unemployment, and then subject to the Phillips curve. Now it's going to be internal and external balance, subject to the movements in internal and external balance. The next step in here is that the two variables of interest here are M and N star. The other values, the other symbols in there are what's called reduced form coefficients. Reduced form coefficients are coefficients that, let me just do that. We're going to use an example, a visual example, because I think it's a little better. Suppose you have an IS schedule, suppose you have an LM schedule. Okay, and this is output equals potential output. This is the equilibrium interest. If you were to change government purchases by a given amount, this distance in here will be given by delta I, delta G, in the very simplest one on minus the margin of propensity. That distance. But when you have an LM schedule, the response in output is not that. It now depends on the slope of the LM schedule. And so if you were to say y equals A plus BG, this will be a reduced coefficient that takes into account both the IS and the LM schedule. Most of the time, except in this diagram, most of the time, we don't know neither the magnitude nor the values of those reduced form coefficients. So there is a fair amount of uncertainty. It is not as in the case of the Phillips curves where it says the thing is downward sloping. I don't know the value of the slope, I know the sign of it. Most of the time we don't know this. And that's going to play a big role in what we're going to do following this. Okay? Nevertheless, just because I don't know it, or just because there is not a cookbook that has, oh, the value for that coefficient is 0.83, that doesn't mean that we cannot assume those values. And then once you derive the solution based on that assumption, then you can say, well, how sensitive is the solution to changes in those assumptions? And we will do that, okay? So this says that if there is an increase, in the money supply, Y will change by B, and And if there's an increase in the foreign money supply, Y will change by Z. And the same, by analogy, we're doing the same thing for the current account. So I want you to know, and this is, when I say I want you to know, I don't mean I want you to know so that you can tell me back in the exam. I want you to know because in less than a year, you're gonna be making a living out of this. And so I don't want you to go into the next step in your career with the illusion that we know these numbers. We don't. And the reason why I want you to know that we don't know these numbers is because if somebody shows up with claim knowledge about it, you know that there are some assumptions that have not been stated explicitly. I want you to be critical. I want you to be skeptical. I want you to ask, how do you know? Okay? All right, so but for the time being, let's not do that now because otherwise, otherwise we just close off and go and have some beer. Okay, so the problem is that these coefficients depend on other coefficients. So small changes to the configuration of the model will change these coefficients big time. Okay, I mentioned that we don't know them. It's not that I'm putting illusions in here, it's that I'm putting something that I don't know the value of it. And finally, just to make the issue a little tractable, is I'm going to assume that there is positive transmission. In other words, I'm going to assume that C and H are both positive. I'm assuming the sign now, not assuming the value. Pete?
Can you walk through that? Because in our diagrams, when we're increasing foreign money supply, we're seeing the loss function
Yeah, no, that,
goes down. Goes up, goes
it
down.
moves. It changes.
Because X and Y are moving in opposite directions with the money supplies. Shouldn't they be negative?
Do I stay? No, these guys?
Yeah.
Okay, take it. Go.
So let's say money supply goes down.
The foreign money supply.
Foreign money supply goes down. Real foreign interest rate goes up.
Yeah,
Exchange rate goes up.
yeah. Depreciates.
Depreciates.
Yeah,
Y goes up.
yeah,
X goes up.
yeah.
That's a net. So M star went down. Y and X went up.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're talking about these guys in here.
Yeah.
I must confess that you are correct.
So unless it's the increase in and raises the foreign income, which purchases more of the invested. As in the channels, one can say. Which channels are you looking at?
No, I'm using the channels. You know, this is a good point. I apologize for the ambiguity or for the error. I think what Pete is talking is about this.
Yeah.
Right. What Jason is talking about is slightly different. What Jason is, this is what Jason is saying, if I raise the foreign money supply, okay, then that's gonna lower the foreign rate, that's gonna increase foreign income, that's gonna increase my exports, that's going to increase my income. Okay? And by putting, correct Jason, and by putting this C here, positive, I'm saying that the two channels, of these two channels, Jason's channel dominates.
Wouldn't that change our indifference curves then?
No, because indifference curves don't care so much whether there is the effect on output is positive or negative. They care whether there is a deviation from potential.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
I mean, suppose I change the arrows, and then the arrows say, well, output declines. Well, it doesn't matter for the loss function. You were squaring it. Okay? But Pete, this is the kind of attitude that I want all you to develop. Right? Now, but let's talk this a little more. Suppose that these guys are negative. Okay? Let's just assume that they're negative. What exactly would then be the point of policy coordination? Or how would it work? So if they expand, we are worse off. If they contract, we are better off. The problem that arises is that then if they contract, they are going to be worse off, even though we're going to be better off. And so the issue arises is, well, why would they be doing this? Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Your original question. Jason? The expansion in the foreign money supply lowers the interest rate decrease. So,
I think increases like investment or output in general of the foreign country. Increases that. Yeah.
slide. The absolute value of Jason later, the absolute, Jason's view. And so, assume. But this is precisely, this is when I say that we don't know those values, is that they're going to be an expansion in foreign money is going to have an effect on us through a variety of channels. One is the one that I'm highlighting there, and the other one is the one that Jason noted. And so you don't know which of these two guys is the bigger one, and therefore you have to make an assumption. If you say, I don't know, and therefore I stop, then we don't know anything more about international policy coordination. Not knowing does not invite paralysis. Not knowing means that you want to arrive at a result and then see the extent to which the answer, the result you derive, is sensitive to changes in those assumptions. Okay? But excellent points. And I want more of this. Not now.
I'm sorry, no.
Okay, go ahead.
So when you say that these are like these reduced form coefficients because they depend on something else.
Correct.
Right? So the issue that's raised between the two the two views of it,
Yeah.
can that be satisfied with whatever is defining C in a different model?
I missed the question.
Okay, yeah, so like since the coefficients are defined by other variables, right?
Right.
Are one of those variables that defines C, one of those that reason what Pete and Jason were talking about? Maybe I'm just like misunderstanding.
No. Suppose this effect is negligible. Okay? Suppose this effect is negligible because the domestic country doesn't export a thing to the foreign country. So the response of X will be small, the response in Y will be small. In that case, this will dominate that. that the exchange rate is not particularly responsive to this. And so the exchange rate response doesn't change all that much. So this channel is not as important as this channel. Okay? Now, I don't know which of these two guys is the large one. But I assume that, and that's the reason, I assume that C is going to be a mixture of this and this is positive. It is going to assume that this is larger than that. It doesn't say that this is absent. It says that this is bigger than that. But you can see, but that's the problem with reduced form coefficients, that you don't know in advance. You don't know in advance the sign of it, and therefore one has to assume it. But essentially the idea is this, that countries, we want to assume that that we benefit from other countries' expansionary policy, and that they benefit from our expansionary policies. That's the assumption that we're maintaining when we say C. Is that true now? No, it isn't true. It is not true because it is controversial, because with the expansion in balance sheets of Japan and of the United States and in Europe, people are saying that, that looks like M star going up and M going up. It looks as though these countries are trying to influence the exchange rate to benefit them. So some people are arguing that Japan's expansionary policy is depreciating the yen, helping the Japanese economy at the expense of Japan's trading partners, particularly the United States. So there's already some bitching in the United States about this. The United States expansionary monetary policy lower the interest rate in the United States, and so capital flew to the emerging markets. Their currencies appreciated, therefore their economic activity declined. So they're saying that the United States is improving the US situation at the expense of those other countries. Okay? And so that's, if you want, the context in which this comes in. We don't know, we don't know those coefficients. And you're gonna see that it's not that we don't know whether it's 1.2 or 1.1 or 1.21. You're gonna see big differences in momentarily. All right. Excellent questions, Pete and Jason's and Megan. That's what I want. Okay? I want you to, clear, I don't want you to take what I say as being correct. All right. I mean, I'm not trying to deceive you by design, but nevertheless. All right, so the next step involves figuring out what this loss, well, okay, so this is the loss function of the monetary authorities in the domestic country. Notice that what we're doing here is to substitute the value of y, and what we're doing here is substituting the value of x, okay? Now comes the next step, and that is that monetary authorities have to solve this problem, make an assumption about what the other country is doing. So, and we assume that the foreign money supply is equal to a given number, M1, M1 star. Okay? And then, so from here on out, we're treating that as given. Then this is this is one function that depends on one variable M, and you find the optimal value of it by differentiating this function and setting that derivative to 0 and solving for the optimal money supply. And here's the solution. I want you to derive this on your own. And it's about 3 or 4 lines of derivations, but I want you to do it. This is going to be, this tells me what's going to be the optimal monetary policy for each level of the foreign monetary policy. The term in parentheses, B times C plus G times H, is not known in advance. So we have to make an assumption about it. And we have to assume that if this term were positive, and I'm happy to make that assumption, if that term were positive, then an increase in the foreign money supply will lead to a contraction in our domestic money. Okay? If the term is negative, then it is the opposite result. But notice how sensitive this solution is to things that we don't know, right? Okay, and so you can imagine me asking you questions. What about if this whole term in parentheses were 0? What would, well, let me ask that. Sharjo, what would that mean if this thing here were equal to 0?
The foreign money supply really doesn't have any effect here.
Say it a little louder.
The foreign money supply, I don't really care about the foreign money supply.
We don't care about the
No,
foreign
we
money
don't.
supply, so there will be no scope for policy coordination.
Yeah,
Okay.
there will be what is coordination.
That's the sort of thing that I want you to, so treat this and say, I don't know much about this thing, but I can set values to this parameter. So another parameter of interest is omega. What if this omega here were 0? Well, that would change things, but it would not make foreign money supply irrelevant. Okay. So here is how it would look for you minimize L conditioned on the value of the foreign money supply. And here is how it would look once you have the domestic and foreign money supply in one chart. Here you have the foreign money supply, here you have the domestic money supply. This is the optimal point. But notice that, just to provide a little intuition, notice that you say, well, how do I know that this is the optimal point just because some dumb equation told me so? And he says, well, no, there are two alternatives, B double prime and B prime, that are consistent with the same level of the foreign money supply. Except that they lie on a worsened difference curve. They are in a difference curve that is outside, that is farther out. And so the domestic policymaker says, I can do B double prime and I can do B prime. I can do that, but I will be worse off because it will be on an indifference curve that it is farther out. And so B is the optimal point. And so notice that what this brings is that in order to nail what is the optimal monetary policy, what we're looking is for tangency points between the given level of the foreign money and the indifference curve. So the given level of the foreign money cannot be cutting the indifference curves. Okay. Then we have what's called the reaction function. This is perhaps one of the more important notions in game theory. It tells me how would my optimal monetary policy react to changes in foreign monetary policy. So it says that if the monetary authorities abroad were to reduce or contract the money supply from M1 star to M2 star, I will react by expanding mine. Okay? So notice that what's being assuming here is that that our reaction function is negative. Okay, and then the foreign guys are going to have something that is just like ours, right? So so far what we have been doing is showing the indifference curve for the domestic policymaker, and I'm now showing you the indifference curve for the foreign policymaker. And so their bliss point is not here, but rather there, and this indifference curve, as we move farther from the upward left, denote increasing losses. So if left up to them, they prefer L1 to L4. All right? So now we have a reaction function for domestic policy, a reaction function for foreign policy. We arrive at something called a Nash equilibrium. Do you know who John Nash is? From the Beautiful Mind, John Nash? This is the guy who invented this graph. Okay? And so when the two reaction functions cut, that cut denotes the Nash equilibrium. And the reason why it's important is because it says that domestic monetary policy is doing the best given its assumption about foreign monetary policy. And the foreign monetary policy is doing what it thinks is best given given the domestic monetary policy. And these assumptions are consistent with each other. In other words, what I assume you were going to be doing turns out to be the best you can do given what I am doing. So it's the reciprocity of assumptions and optimality that makes the Nash point such a big deal. Notice that notice that we haven't said a word about cooperation. Here's each policymaker is finding the best that it can do with a given assumption about foreign guys. So it gives rise to the reaction function. So this Nash does not involve cooperation. This Nash says, Jeff, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, is this like in micro if you did it at Dropbox? If you did on the website?
Well, what are in the export box?
Like just with the indifference curve, you're saying like where they intersect for each representative, like.
I'm just trying to remember, you have two lines, so you have one, you have one individual, you have another individual. My apologies, I know.
Yeah.
And so the question is.
Is that comparable? Cause
Yes.
you're saying what they're represented, yeah.
Yes, it is comparable in the sense that, in micro, what you have is probably is to prove that what I used to know as the first theorem of welfare economics, that you cannot make one better off without making somebody else worse off. And so you want those you want those indifference curves tangent to each other. Is that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, here we're gonna get to that. Okay, what the difference between what we're doing here and welfare economics is that in that view of the world, there's no need for government intervention. That the price system will induce individuals to choose what's best for them, and in the process make everybody as well off as they can be. Here, that doesn't happen automatically. Here, if left to their own devices, policymakers will wind up at point N. And so the appeal of point N is that it is not that I'm assuming what I'm assuming you're doing happens to be the best thing for you to do, and what you're assuming I'm doing happens to be the best that I can do. So there is, right now, think of this as the existence proposition that says, yes, this can be. Okay? So this is the Nash equilibrium. Okay. Now, look at this, and let's stare at it for maybe 10 minutes without me saying a word. Starting now. And when we get bored, which for me will be about 10 seconds, then we say, so what do I do with this crap? Live it. Well, entertain this point in here. Let's call that capital X. What would be true from the standpoint of the domestic country? What would be that true from the standpoint of the guys holding this indifference curve? Well, what would be true is that if that point were feasible, and it would be preferred to the domestic policymakers, right? Because it will be laying on an indifference curve that is to the right of this thing. So it will be closer to nirvana. And what about the foreign guys? Well, if X were feasible, then it will be to the left of this indifference curve, so it will be closer to their nirvana. And so X is a point that makes both policymakers better off. The question is, how do they get there? That make sense? All right. Well, so the issue now is, remember these are now policy variables. Unlike the case that Jeff brought up about the Edgeworth Square box. Policymakers have controls over the variables that are in here. Individuals do not have control over their prices. And so, let's ask Peter over there. Peter, we have identified point X as being one which will be presumably better off, that will make both policymakers better off. Is there a way from this diagram that will enable you to see how to get to point X?
By changing the money supplies domestically
Perfect.
and foreign. And then you
That-
create a line of all the X's that would be.
Perfect, but here's, so I have that in here. Right? So notice that, let's see if I have. Notice that policymakers acting on their own will make themselves worse off. So if the policymaker, this guy were to say, okay, I raised the money supply by my little self, I'm gonna wind up on a lower difference curve. And if the domestic guy were to raise the money supply by its little self, it will wind up on a worse difference curve. So there has to be an element of cooperation. That's what international cooperation is all about, is that I am not going to be acting unilaterally because I know that I will be worse off. I need to get together with the other guys and let's say, hey, let's raise the money supply together. And so, in principle, there's going to be a point, by raising the money supply, there's going to be a point that will make them both better off. Okay? Now, you can imagine that there will be one possibility is a point there, another possibility is a point there. I mean, there's tons of points in there. And the issue is, how do they reach an agreement on to how much to expand the money supply? And the only thing we have done in here is to identify that there is scope for improvement. We haven't identified who benefits the most. And so in this case, the way I drew it in here, it ultimately is going to depend on the bargaining power of each country. And so what you're seeing here is, I try to make it as balanced or fair as possible. So we go from point N to point B, where B stands for bargain. And notice that the domestic policy guys are going to be better off because the difference curve is now closer to their nirvana, and the foreign policy guys are going to be better off because they're going to be closer to their nirvana. And so we're now at B. And that entails raising both the foreign and the domestic money supply. What's absent from here is a characterization of the protocol that is involved in the two countries agreeing to the specified amounts of increases in monetary policy. I drew this. But you can imagine that for the purposes of an honest-to-God policy-making deal, we have to agree on the magnitudes, and we have to find a way that we're not going to cheat. And so this is what's called a one-shot game, where we're not going to be revising the game down the road. Okay. Now, and so the question that arises is, well, now what? What do you do with this? I mean, somehow, right now, there is think of this as the blueprint for a house or the blueprint for a building. It says that it can be done. It doesn't tell you much more details, but in terms of feasibility, it says it is conceivable that policymakers, by acting in unison, cooperatively, they can improve their welfare. The next step involves, well, how would we go about doing that? So this is so we have to use macroeconometrics for this because we have to estimate those effects. Remember, we're assuming values for these parameters, and so long as we're maintaining those assumptions, then we can say, yes, we're gonna be better off, or we don't know whether those assumptions are correct. And so now we have to estimate models that quantify those effects. Okay, and so normally what has been done, or what I'm now going over the paper by Frankel, what is done is to go over conventional macroeconometric modeling that has not quite the ISLM frame of mind, but close to it. So there's going to be a goods market, a money market, a labor market, and those things are very, very close to related to the ISLM. And so here it is. You know this, but let me just, however, state what is known. That if there were to be an increase in the money supply, the domestic rate will go down. If the domestic rate goes down, there's going to be a depreciation of the domestic currency. That raises exports, lowers imports, improves the current account, and raises economic activity. And therefore, the LM schedule shifts to the right. So that's, you know this. I mean, this is the first lecture that I had in here. And so economic activity increases. Exhibit A. What's going on in the foreign country? Well, now comes the music. Because for us to increase our exports, that means their imports have to increase. Because our exports are their imports. Second, when we contract our imports, we're in effect contracting their exports. Which means that the same domestic expansion in monetary policy has a slightly different take abroad because their IS schedule is going to shift to the left. And so their economic activity is going to go down. Caution? We're okay or not okay?
So that's Pete's stance right there.
Yeah. No, that's not Pete's stance. This is, yes, I'm sorry, that's Pete's stance. Yeah. Now, the issue is there any evidence for this? Okay, this is going to take a moment, and I will finish this exhibit, and then we ditch. Okay. Well, I was at the Fed. I used to be in the business of building macroeconometric models, and you may imagine that I was not the only guy doing this. So this is the one from the Federal Reserve. It's called the MCM. It used to be called the MCM, which stood for multi-country model. This is for the European Economic Community. This is from, I think it's Japan. Let me make sure. I think that this is the model from Japan, Economic Planning Agency. I think from Benji, does it sound right to you? Say yes. Good. Okay. Yes. Where to go? Okay. Now we have a collection of other models. John Taylor had a model that competed with us. All right. Think of these models not unlike the one you did in the first assignment. So it's a bunch of equations and you change parameters, you change assumptions. Okay. What's being changing here is an expansion in the money supply. And we start by changing it in monetary expansion in the United States. And so I want you to look at this row. And so the MCM predicts that after a few years or after a few quarters, economic activity in the United States increases by 1.5%, that the price level increases by 0.4%, that the interest rate declines, and that the dollar depreciates. And then we go and examine what happens abroad. The current account in the United States drops, the foreign current account drops, the foreign interest rate drops, and the last entry is the one that I want to concentrate. Economic activity abroad drops. By abroad, I mean the rest of the world. And so you say, well, this doesn't sound so weird. An economic expansion at home has more of an effect than abroad. Fine. Now we're going to take the model from the OECD. And we repeat the same exercise. Okay? An expansion in the money supply in the OECD gives a little more of an effect on output, a little more of an effect on the inflation rate, very different response in the interest rate, fairly different response in the exchange rates, and interestingly enough, raises the level of foreign economic activity. So you have, out of all these models, the same change in assumptions implemented. One of them tells that an expansion in US money contracts foreign income. The OECD says it raises foreign income. That's the sense in which we don't know what these coefficients are. These are the reduced coefficients. These are what we would be calling the money multipliers. Okay? Now all of this is done from the standpoint of two models, an expansion in the US money supply. We can repeat the same exercise by asking what would happen if there were an increase in the money supply in the rest of the OECD, that is, the OECD excluding the United States. And so you will have that there's an expansion in OECD income and pretty much no effect on output in the United States if you use the MCM. If you use the OECD model, there will be an expansion in OECD income and a tiny expansion in US. All right, so far we have, I think, the typical thing that you put a bunch of economists confronted with the same data, you go and say, do something, and they do very different things and give you very different answers. So this, I don't want for this to be news to you. What I want, however, is for you to see the differences in the magnitudes, that they are not small. What we're going to be doing next time is adding the following layer of ambiguity. Namely, I, as the US policymaker, have a choice of what model to follow. I, as a foreign policymaker, have a choice of what model to follow. So, if I were a US policymaker, I probably would be using the model from the Federal Reserve, which is the MCM. So this, to the Federal Reserve authorities, is reality. This dashed line is what the reality is for the rest of the OECD monetary authorities. And these realities are very different. And so there's going to be a fair amount of annoyances when we are not just going to be talking about less coordinated monetary policy, but instead what we're going to be talking about is what model are we going to use, and how do we know that that model is any close to reality? You see the layers, right? First, less coordinated. Second, what model do we use? Third, what assurance do we have that reliance on any particular model will yield an outcome that makes us better off? Which is why we use currency swaps. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Of course, you can stay. And so for for next Thursday, please make sure that, in case you weren't here when I said it, I'm going to be bringing a member from each group. I'm not going to be picking a random. I say, I want somebody from group 1. And then the guys and the individuals in group 1 somehow battle it out. And it says, we want so to be the representative. And I want that so to come in here and sketch out the answers. Notice, okay, you take this equation divided by 2, move that term to the left. That's not what I'm asking. I'm looking for something that is persuasive enough that I said, yes, they know what it is. Okay? So we do that. All right.
Just to clarify, are you going to want hard copies